This week, Emmet joins me to review the book Shazam, a celebration of 75 years, which recounts some of the twists and turns in the publishing history of Captain Marvel. And we'll also talk a bit about last spring's Shazam movie. First, just a reminder that you can help this podcast by making your Amazon purchases via deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon, and make that your bookmark for future purchases. Deconstructing Comics earns a bit of money from your purchase that helps us keep the show going. We really appreciate your support. This is Tim.
This is Emmet.
And this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Tim in Tokyo with Emmet in Melbourne. How are you doing?
I'm very well, sir.
Okay. Yeah, I think now, of course, we did one or two Spider-Man 1963s together, but did we do a Deconstructing Comics besides Aquaman?
I don't know. I can't recall.
I kind of don't think so. And that Aquaman one was several years ago now. 2014, yes. I think.
Yes, it was. Gosh.
So, and this time we're doing another, DC hero, although he didn't start out that way.
He's had a complicated publishing history.
Oh my gosh,
and then he lost his name to another company, so
Yeah. So
he's had a hard time.
Captain Marvel, a.k.a. Shazam. So, yeah. By the way, have you seen the movie that came out this year?
I have, and I had because we're going to be talking about the collected stories of Shazam. What's the title? It's the
Shazam,
Celebration of 75 Years.
Celebration of 75 Years.
Right, and I had a specific point to raise in relation to the film.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the film kind of gets
Jeff Johns
brought up here and
Jeff
there
in
my notes.
Sorry.
You know. Go ahead.
Yeah. I was just going to say Jeff Johns was involved both in the making of the film and he has written the most recent version of Shazam. Mm-hmm. And it turns out he used the same story.
Right, yeah. I found the very last story in the book from Justice League 21 in 2013 has a lot of elements that are in the movie.
Yes.
It's not precisely the same story. The villain is different, but a lot of it is the same. Anyway, so celebration of 75 years. So when I was in Chicago in April, and I was going around, I went to, ended up being 3 comic shops one morning, recording for the podcast. And I knew that later that day I was going to be seeing the Shazam movie. I had all mapped out when and where I was going to see it. And whenever I walk into a comic shop, because it's so rare for me to walk into a comic shop, especially, an American one, I feel like I want to buy something. And I'm like, well, I don't have any storage space and I could just get it on Comixology, but, I really want to get something I can hold in my hand and read and Captain Marvel was on my mind, so I wanted to pick out something with him in it, and so I found, the biggest book I could find with Captain Marvel in it to take up the most possible room in my suitcase and on my bookshelf. It's not that big, but it's a few hundred pages, on its way to 400 pages, I think. So now, and then of course I wanted to do a podcast about it, and I mentioned it to you, and you said you already had the book. What precipitated your buying it?
I love Captain Marvel, and aka Shazam, aka, as it turns out from this book, Captain Thunder, which I wasn't aware of. That shows how much of a bad fan I am. And if I see something about the character, I will snap it up. And I think around the time of the movie, there was a digital sale on, and that's where I saw this, and I just grabbed it during that sale.
Oh, so you have the digital version?
I have the digital version.
Okay.
Yeah. which would have been kinder for you on your
Yes.
luggage. Yeah.
Yeah. But, it's weird because I've always been kind of fascinated with Captain Marvel, even though I barely seen or read anything that he was in. Because, growing up in the 70s, actually, though, that was about the time that he was reintroduced after 20 years of no published appearances at all. But I was never a DC reader. The TV show was right in I was the right age for it. It was on from 74 to 77. The TV show didn't really appeal to me for some reason. Maybe it just looked too hokey. I saw it a few times.
But can I ask you, given you are the host of To the Bat Poles, wasn't there a crossover episode where all the different Justice League characters met with Adam West's Batman?
Well, now it's still on my DVD shelf here that I haven't actually watched it yet. Eventually it's going to come up on the podcast. The Legends of the Superheroes,
Right.
2 specials that came out about 1979, I think. And I had not really realized it, but I did see on Wikipedia today, yes, Captain Marvel was in that, along with Adam West and Burt Ward as Batman and Robin, and some other DC heroes. But yeah, as of right now, I have not watched it yet. It's still on my to-do list.
Well, I'd be curious to hear what you think of it, because I think that's something of a neglected feature of the Captain Marvel pop culture history. It's something I don't see discussed. It only actually popped into my head because I saw someone the other day cracking a joke on social media about release the Snyder Cut, referring to this fan movement to have the unedited Zack Snyder version of the Justice League movie. And the person, as a joke, had used the promotional image of Adam West, Burt Ward, and all the other actors playing a host of Justice League characters and Justice League villains, and among them was Captain Marvel. And that was my introduction to it, as part of a joke, taking the piss out of this Zack Snyder Defense League. And I was like, I need to see this. I need to watch this. Because if you haven't had the pleasure, and for those long-term Deconstructing Comics listeners, I may be repeating myself a bit here, because I interviewed Brian Cremens for this show, because he wrote a book called Captain Marvel and the Art of Nostalgia. And we both talked about our love of the character and our respective histories of the character. But I dug into the 1930s television serials about Captain Marvel. Like, it's one of the earliest superhero serials out there. And it's incredibly violent.
Yeah, I think it was actually the first one. He got to the screen before any other superhero, including Superman and Batman, and he was the most popular superhero in the mid 40s, which is kind of surprising to think about now.
And Billy Batson is clearly a grown adult, and Captain Marvel himself is this giant of a man who throws criminals off cliffs.
Wow.
It's very violent.
Huh. Yeah, one of the kind of weird things about the character is, to have, the alter ego is a kid, where, the hero is an adult. And, before, I think it was before, it's in my notes later, late 80s, early 90s. Before that point, when he was Captain Marvel, he was a completely different person and had an adult mature personality.
Exactly.
Later it became, it was still Billy Batson's child mind in him.
Yes, an addition that I really dislike. That comes from someone. Please correct me if I'm wrong in this, but I believe it comes from Justice League International, where you have this sort of comedic slant to all these different characters, and it introduces a version of Captain Marvel who has the mind of Billy Batson, and he speaks in this sort of shucks, gee willikers type of way.
Mm-hmm.
And the joke is that he's behaving in this childish way, and all the other superheroes look down on him because he's clearly a moron. And that's the joke. And I really dislike it because the idea of Shazam, and I think this is the reason he has such an enduring appeal, and it's the reason why you may have an interest in him too, is it's a child fantasy of becoming the perfect adult, including having the wisdom of Solomon, having intelligence, knowing what's going on, the thing that children don't have. They don't have an awareness of what's really going on. They have their own private world of private meanings and associations, and adults are separate from children. Whereas Billy can leapfrog that and become Captain Marvel, Shazam, and he knows everything. He has this awareness of everything. He also has strength. He has speed. He can fly. He can fight fantastical creatures and then come back and return to being a child, then tell stories because he's a cub journalist as well. And that's what makes him so fascinating, I believe. He's a child's idea of what he wants to be, and then he can just become it with the magic word. I think it's one of the most pure superhero ideas out there.
Yeah, on the other hand, I think the idea of having him still be a kid in an adult's body worked for the movie because you kind of want that arc where he kind of gradually comes into it and has that feeling of awe when he first turns into it and doesn't quite know his powers and everything. And I think that if he had changed into this mature superhero adult who already knew everything about how he needed to do stuff, there's no arc for the character then.
Potentially. I mean, it could be that there are characters in his life who are then reacting to him because he's become this other thing. But I did enjoy the movie a lot, and I thought that Zachary Levi did a great job sort of being that childish version of the character. So I think that's the version of Shazam we're stuck with now. That's the interpretation, and it's fine. But it's sort of it does belay the wish fulfillment to me, anyway. But I think that's now become the established version of him.
Yeah. And by the way, I found it in my notes. This is from Wikipedia. It's talking about just after Crisis of Infinite Earths in the 80s. It said the most notable change that Roy and Dan Thomas, Keith Giffen, and J.M. DeMatteis introduced into the Captain Marvel mythos was that the personality of young Billy Batson is retained when he transforms into the Captain. This change would remain for most future uses of the character as justification for his sunny Golden Age personality in the darker modern-day comic book world, instead of the traditional depiction used prior to 1986, which tended to treat Captain Marvel and Billy as two separate personalities. So I guess, their reasoning is that the kind of comic story that they used to do with him wouldn't be acceptable to readers anymore, they assume. But in order to have some sort of lightheartedness to it, having him be a kid adds that dimension rather than cartoony art and goofy stuff going on.
I mean, I would counter that Grant Morrison did a Justice League story with Howard Porter. It's issues 28 to 31 of JLA. It's called Crisis Times 5. And I think it's one of the great Shazam stories. And in it, the race of fifth dimensional imps start invading our world, and the Justice League and Superman can't fight back because they're up against these creatures who exist outside our version of time and space. Like, they actually have a different perception of what we see. And Captain Marvel, as a creature of fantasy, is the only one who can handle them. He's the only one who's able to fight back. And Morrison interpreted this idea of this imaginative character, this freedom of imagination, because he is a child who becomes a man, is able to interpret something that the adults can't interpret. And then he portrayed Shazam in a way that wasn't ridiculous and silly. He was somehow embracing the irrational because Superman can't. And I think
Hmm.
I might that I know that sounds like a lot, it's a bit of a word salad, but it's also one of the most interpreted. Sorry, it's one of the best interpretations of the character, and exactly answering what you just said a moment ago. Like, if he has all these abilities, where how can we relate to him?
Hmm.
And what Grant Morrison did was, well, okay, let's him be the character who's able to handle magical situations and issues of super science that go beyond human understanding. You've got Captain Marvel and Shazam. He can do it. He's the one who's qualified to handle these situations. I thought that was a really interesting approach. And I was very sorry to see that it didn't actually feature in this collection.
Hmm.
Because you've got a few stories in here which are very good. Um, I'm thinking in particular of the Captain Marvel Jr. story with the art by Macro Boy, which is just absolutely stunning from 1943. But there's some stories in here which, I think could have been lost or
Yeah. Well.
don't rate as well as the Grant Morrison story does.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll kind of get into that. Because I thought the first part of the book, that runs up to the cancellation in
Mm,
52 or 3, I thought that was kind of the most satisfying part of the book.
mm,
I mean, this is the era when he was really popular. I saw that in 1944, Captain Marvel Adventures came out bi-weekly, and each issue sold 1.3 million copies.
mm.
And I don't know, I I thought the selections that are here were pretty good. I particularly liked, let's see, Captain Marvel Adventures number 39. It looks as if they have had to photograph printed pages. It looks different from everything else in the book because you can see all the dots in the coloring.
Right.
But yeah, this has Mr. Mind in it, and it's a really funny story. Now there's no credit in the book, but I looked it up, and the writer was Otto Binder. Not sure if that's a long or short I.
Mm.
And of course drawn by C.C. Beck.
CC Beck.
Yeah. But yeah, I thought this was possibly the most entertaining story in the book, and I'd read this as much as there was available of this. I would read it.
Mm. It's funny. I looked up some reviews of this collection, and I can't recall where I found it. I think it was on someone's blog, but the person echoed your exact sentiment. They felt that the classic issues really captured something, and they really had this thrust to them that they enjoyed. And then they commented on the later issues that are featured in this collection, in particular stuff from the 90s onwards. And the reviewer says they've lost the understanding of what the character is. There's something missing. There's a missing element.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of it is what you addressed before, which is this sense that the character doesn't work anymore because we're far more real now. We're a little more grittier now. And if anything, I think the character could work more now because now you have such diversity of artistic talent in the comic industry. You don't have these flat house styles anymore. You have art which surpasses what Beck was doing with some of those beautiful Art Deco, like the beautiful image of the train in the initial story, which they keep returning to, and they keep trying to recapture what he was doing there. There are so many artists today who have that same broad sense of artistic style, and they could be doing things with this character concept that would push in all these different directions. And there isn't that need, or there isn't that feeling that they can use that with the character. Instead, they're trying to make Shazam be yet another muscle-bound bruiser who looks quite threatening, but he's got lightning crackling around his eyes and everything. This is Gary Frank who does the Justice League backup story that Jeff Johns wrote. It's a very ugly version of this wholesome character. And I don't understand why they don't hire somebody else who has a more dynamic art style, and then someone who could write to that and have that sort of playfulness that I think really suits the character.
Yeah, I mean, my experience reading Jeff Johns, it's not a lot. It's, some Aquaman before
Yes.
the podcast that we did 5 years ago, and then some in here. But it doesn't appear that Jeff Johns can write comedy, or at least he doesn't ever, from what I can see. And, fortunately, the movie was pretty funny, although I thought other parts of it were a little too heavy.
Yeah, a lot of people have commented on the boardroom scene
Yes,
being
oh my
a bit
gosh.
too violent.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And I had recommended the film to a colleague, and then they brought their kid to see it.
Uh-huh.
And apparently the kid got very upset in that scene.
I would guess.
Now, I don't think it's a bad thing for kids to be scared of movies sometimes. Like, I was talking to somebody the other day about, I still can remember seeing Tim Burton's Batman in the cinema, and the reveal of Joker's girlfriend with the scarred face frightened me as a child. And I treasure that memory because, being scared in the cinema is cool. It's an enjoyable thing. But what I felt was a bit off-putting about the Shazam scene. There's a scene in the movie, there's a boardroom sequence where these characters are killed by Mark Strong's character, who's possessed by the
Dr. Savannah.
spirits of evil.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And they weren't just killed. They were tortured to death. They seemed to be hurt with glee and some sadism, and I really did not like that scene at all.
Yeah. Well, I don't remember the director's name, but I know he had done horror movies before Shazam. And I wondered if that was the influence that was coming in there. Seemed to
yes,
be.
he's a Swedish director, I believe, and David Sandberg, and that I think horror and comedy are very closely related because they're all about setups and executions, And I could absolutely see how somebody with a background in horror would work with this premise because you have this idea of pushing what is real to the extreme. Horror does that. But yeah, his sensibilities, while true for the project, I think it's overall a very enjoyable film. There were, again, like those moments where I think he pushed it too far, and I was like, "What are you doing? Like, no, this is not what should work with this character." But
besides that, I thought that if you just took the movie and cut the boardroom scene out, I didn't think that it would hurt it that much. It didn't seem like it really needed to be there.
I'm trying to think. Maybe it serves to create a sense of scale, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure it works.
Anyway, getting back to the 1940s, I thought we should explain a little bit for people who don't know much about the character. And explain, what the world of Captain Marvel was, in the 40s. And of course, it starts out Billy Batson. He's homeless. He's selling newspapers on the street, and this dark stranger in a trench coat and a big hat. Where did that guy come from? He's not in the movie, but I don't think it's that. Well, maybe in later iterations they try to explain who he is, but.
It reads very bad now. It reads like it's stranger danger.
Yeah.
It's very. I can't imagine them executing that on film. But I think the suggestion is that it's Shazam. It's a sort of shadow aspect of Shazam.
Mm-hmm. But he directs Billy to this subway. You mentioned the highly decorated train car that's in the subway, and it takes him to meet the wizard Shazam, and in this big underground hall where there are the statues of the 7 deadly sins. Now, I think in the movie they changed it a little bit where they are the 7 deadly sins demons who are captured and Savannah releases them. Although there is a story in here where those statues come to life, but they all just look like schlubby bald guys, not demons. So that's something that was changed in the movie. But there were, since it was such a big selling comic, they launched, there were plenty of spin-offs from it. Let's cash in on it. And they had, let's see, Captain Marvel Jr., who is, of course, Freddy. And Freddy was in the movie, and he was walking on crutches. This is from Wikipedia. So, Captain Marvel Jr.'s alter ego was Freddie Freeman, a disabled newsboy saved by Captain Marvel from the villainous Captain Nazi. To save the dying boy's life, Captain Marvel shares his powers with Freddie. By saying the name Captain Marvel, Freddie is transformed into Captain Marvel Jr., a blue-costumed version of himself, possessing powers of superhuman strength, speed, wisdom, and more. And it's when he wants to change, he says Captain Marvel, because that's the source of his powers rather than the wizard Shazam. Now, that story is not in the book, but they do have the first story of Mary Marvel in here, who they had to have modeled her after Judy Garland.
Oh, yes. I think so.
I mean, I did find that Captain Marvel himself was supposed to have been modeled on Fred McMurray, of all people.
Yeah, I saw that a few years ago. There was, I think I saw a recent article. They got Alex Ross to do a cover where they used McMurray's likeness, and it's very convincing. You look at it and go, "Oh, yes, obviously that's who it is." But McMurray has that wholesomeness about him as well, which is why he made for such a good film noir actor when they used him in, it was a Double Indemnity where he appeared in that, and you look at that and you go, oh, but he's so wholesome, how could he be bad? And it works so well. But yeah, Shazam and Captain Marvel, I must confess, I'm going to get confused knowing which name to use. He will always be Captain Marvel to me, but yeah, he just has that sort of constantly smiling face, with the thin eyes that C.C. Beck does, that a few artists down through the years have tried to recreate, this sort of smiling eyes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the story of how he finds out about Mary, so she is his twin sister, but he didn't know about her. And in the story, it's so preposterous. He gets a letter where he's being called to the deathbed of the nurse who delivered him and his sister.
But tell them it beforehand, because he was hosting.
Right, well, she was there in the room with him when he got the letter, but he had no idea that was his sister. It was some kind of a on-the-radio game show.
They were doing a radio quiz, yes.
Which had to have been modeled on the Quiz Kids show that was a real thing at the time.
Yep.
So, yeah, he's called away, not knowing that he's walking out of the room where his sister is. And she, this nurse reveals the whole story of how this other couple's baby had died, and Mary and Billy's parents were dead, and so she substituted Mary for the dead baby, and the parents took her, so at least she had a home, but Billy had to go to an orphanage. And in the story, then he realizes, well, there's this broken locket that fits together. It's an old trope. Now, I thought was particularly funny about the story is when they realize they're brother and sister, then suddenly the Captain Marvel powers are hereditary. And she says, "Well, I'm your sister, so maybe I can do it too." Shazam! Blam! She's Mary Marvel now. But. Was that true beforehand? Maybe she never tried saying Shazam, but...
Well, again, you got the wish fulfillment. I mean, how many kids read that comic and immediately said Shazam?
Maybe it works for me too.
Just try it on. I mean, that's the secret of the character. That's why it's so appealing. You just have to say a word, and you become this dream version of yourself.
Mm-hmm. And it's significant, too, that, even considering what time period this was done in, they didn't, water down the powers for the girl. She's just as strong as Captain Marvel.
Although he's very upset about the fact that she's got the powers, and he tries to argue the point with the Wizard Shazam, the ghost of the Wizard Shazam, because he's saying, how can she have these powers? She's a girl. And then they come up with these pantheon of characters because Shazam is an acronym, that have the equivalent abilities of their male pantheon, and that bit made no sense to me. It was like, why can't she have the powers of Zeus? Why can't she have the power of Solomon? Why does she need the power of Artemis? Like, I don't get it. But Otto Binder had some issues, I suspect.
Well, I realized the Freddy story is shown in here in Marvel Family Comics #1. I know maybe it's a flashback here. This is the part of the book I read a month or two ago. But yeah, it does show him bringing Freddy to the Wizard, and Freddy wakes up and says, "Why, it's Captain Marvel," and then lightning strikes, and he's Captain Marvel Jr.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and it's interesting. I mean, 2 points. One quickly, I mean, I think we will get to later comics again in a bit,
yes.
but Jeff Johns does spend a bit of time in the Justice League backup story, like obsessing over that idea of family, and can you pass along Shazam to your family? What if family is something you choose? And then that becomes the secret of that storyline. And I thought it's interesting how later writers are so literal about reinterpreting this idea, which is just pure wish fulfillment. Just make up your own rules. It doesn't really matter. But the point I wanted to raise about the Captain Marvel Jr. comic and the Mary Marvel comic and all the other Toki Tawny and all these other characters that are going to be introduced, the success of the Marvel Family franchise must have been a real pain in the arse for all the other publishers, to the point where you have Superman, Supergirl, Superboy, and Jimmy Olsen and Lois Lane, and then Batman. You got Robin, you got Batwoman, who was first, wasn't it? And so on. And then you have all these other rival books copying what Binder and Beck and the other artists and writers who came on board at Fawcett were doing, because it was a successful formula.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the thing that worked was you don't just have a superhero who is an adult. You have superheroes who are children. And then that is also something that children can relate to. So I feel like the Marvel family created a lot of tropes around superheroes that we don't really credit Fawcett for. We tend to associate them with Superman because we got Superboy and Supergirl and all the rest of it. But the Marvel family did it first, I believe. Now, again, someone write in and tell me I'm wrong, but that's my belief, that Captain Marvel and his family of characters, they typified a lot of things that we now take for granted.
Yeah, I'm not sure when they started introducing those families in Superman and Batman, but yeah, Mary Marvel dates from 1942. That's pretty early. Superman's what, 39,
I thought? 38, 39?
Batman's 39. I think Superman might be 38.
That'd be it then.
So, but yeah, I don't know when those characters started having families. Yeah, Captain Marvel appeared early 1940.
But the difference was that Captain Marvel was much more successful than Superman.
Right, yeah. Somehow Fawcett captured the zeitgeist better than the then publishers of Superman and Batman did. Yeah, another family member is this Uncle Dudley, who
yes.
I guess he's some kind of a con artist who comes in and claims he's Mary's uncle, and then he finds out that they're the Marvel family, and so he says, "Well, so am I." And he's got this costume that he just kind of puts on. He doesn't have any powers. He can't get anything if he says Shazam. But I read that because the Marvels have the wisdom of Solomon, they get that he's tricking them, but they think he's a lovable old fraud, so they just kind of humor him.
Yeah. It's a beautiful idea again. He's just this old man and they just feel sorry for him, so they have him come along and they pretend not to notice he's pulling his costume out of a bag or whatever.
Yeah, and Wikipedia says, when asked to make use of his supposed superpowers, Dudley would always complain that his Shazam Bago was acting up and was interfering with his powers, though the Marvels always knew better. Yeah, I mean, that's too goofy for modern comics, although I wouldn't mind it if somebody did put out a story. I think I'd buy it if they put out something like that now.
Yeah, and it's a shame that the collection doesn't feature the Toki Tawny stories as well, because, again, I'll refer to the interview with Brian Cremens. In his book, he talks about Otto Binder doing a lot of autobiographical comics with Toki Tawny, who's a frustrated novelist. And he himself was a frustrated novelist. He was pumping out these comic scripts, and they were very successful. But he wasn't getting paid a lot of money. But there must have been that tension that between, well, I'm expressing myself creatively, I'm getting these stories out there, but I'm not making a lot of money, and it's probably not going to last very long. And the character, this talking tiger, has the same dilemma. He has these fantastical adventures, but he just wants to create stories, and he just wants to be able to make people happy with his storytelling. And that is just this interesting example of a writer being given this platform to just play. Mm-hmm. And I can't think of many mainstream superhero comics today that have that same accessibility for the creative team. Like, 'cause I think a lot of the time they're carrying water for these intellectual properties, and that's the job, that's the gig, that's what you do. You just make sure that we continue to be solvent as a property.
Yeah, well, especially since Marvel and DC are both owned by major media conglomerates now.
Yeah. No, Fawcett and National and Atlas and all the other publishers back in the day, I mean, they were by and large crooks. The people working for them made very little money, and I don't know how much job satisfaction there was, but I think there was an attitude of just throw things at the wall and see what sticks. And when you have that kind of situation, you do, almost by accident, have moments of genius. Mm-hmm. And I think Captain Marvel is an example of that. It's just something that really, really works. And it's a product that system of experimentation. We don't really have that. Yeah, I don't want to overstep my mark here, because I think there are some amazing comics being produced right now, in both independent scene and in mainstream publishing. But it feels to me like this is the Wild West. There's lots of crazy ideas out there, and some of them are amazing, and they weren't looking at the bottom line. They were just trying to pump out stories, and we get some glorious pieces of work as a result.
Mm-hmm. Coming up, was Captain Marvel really a ripoff of Superman? Who was Captain Thunder? What is it about the character of Captain Marvel that just doesn't fit with modern DC comics? And more. First, thanks to all our patrons at patreon.com/deconcomics, more classic episodes of Deconstructing Comics have been unlocked, and I'm releasing them at the rate of one per week, in reverse order. This week, episode 98, in which Brandon and I discuss Craig Thompson's award-winning graphic novel, Blankets. The classic episodes can be found on our Facebook and Twitter feeds, by clicking on the earliest months listed on the left sidebar at deconstructingcomics.com, or in publicly available posts on our Patreon page. Check out all our goals and help us reach them at patreon.com/deconcomics. When you watched Batman as a kid, you enjoyed the colorful heroes and villains, the text sound effects on the screen, the thrill of watching a heroic crime fighter escaping from death traps and taking down bad guys. But the show was devised to interest adults, too. What did you miss as a kid? Sexual innuendo.
The penguin's too small for me.
Closeted gay characters.
I like that cape, Batman.
Freudian death traps.
Has the giant clam really swallowed Robin?
Police incompetence.
Bruce Wayne is a millionaire playboy. Hardly a secret identity for Batman.
Whether you're a kid or an adult, there's something to like about our favorite Caped Crusader. Tim and Paul dig for the deeper meanings under the Batmania every other Thursday. What's the podcast's name?
To the Batpoles. To the Batpoles. To the Batpoles.
Yeah, you mentioned Toki Tawny, and Now, I'm sure that it must have been a real headache trying to choose which stories to put in this book without making it 1,000 pages. But yeah, it is kind of unsatisfying that the only appearances of Tawny come pretty late in the book, and you're like, where'd this character come from?
Yeah. And a lot of the appearances in this collection also feature Superman sort of ushering Shazam into DC Universe proper.
Mm-hmm.
It's, come this way, young man, let me show you the ropes. When, of course, the reality was Captain Marvel was a more successful character, and Fawcett folded through death of 1,000 cuts. There was this long-standing legal action against them. This judge agreed with the argument that, yes, he clearly is a ripoff of this other character. And as a result, just due to the combination of time and legal fees, Fawcett were like, all right, look, we're walking away from this.
Yeah, so National Periodicals, which eventually became DC, I might just call them DC, but I mean National Periodicals, they first filed a suit in 1941. So, I mean... Captain Marvel's only been on the stands about a year, and they're saying, "Oh, you ripped off Superman. He's too much like Superman."
Correct me if I'm wrong, but in American copyright law, isn't there something to the effect that you are almost legally obliged to do that if there is a case to be made? There's this, you need to defend your copyright.
Yeah, maybe.
Is there something? But I mean, my question in relation to this case, and I haven't read it as in depth as I probably should have, if I'm going to be talking about it, is that there are significant differences between the two characters. And I think the argument was, well, he has a cape and he can fly, and he has super strength, so he's the same character.
Mm-hmm.
But he's a boy who becomes a superhero. It's more, he's got these magical powers. He's more in this magical frame of storytelling. It's almost like apparently Binder considered it, and he testified. He considered it more an Arthurian story. Like it's the young Arthur pulls the sword out of the stone and becomes a hero. Billy says a magic word and becomes a hero. That's what he was going for. And then he gathers together his friends. He shares his power among his friends.
Mm-hmm.
That's how he framed it. And Superman is about the individual, the alien. His powers come from science. I don't know if was it always consistent that Superman's powers come from the sun? I believe it always has been. It's just the yellow sun that gives him his powers. It's a different concept, but I guess that just didn't hold much water legally, and Fawcett couldn't maintain that argument.
From what I read on Wikipedia, there's a little bit of stuff in the book, the E. Nelson Bridwell essay that was originally published in 1978. But so what I read online was that so first filed in 1941, finally came to trial in 1948.
Wow.
The case was dismissed on a technicality, which was that DC was found to have been negligent by not copyrighting some of its Superman newspaper strips.
Right.
So
okay.
that judge said, well, you can't say that he was stolen because you didn't bother to copyright some of the stuff. But then National appealed the decision, and the decision made in 1952 was that the Superman copyright was valid. The character of Captain Marvel itself was not an infringement, but actually the decision was that specific stories or super feats could be infringements. But this would have to be determined in a retrial. So it wasn't a exact decision, but he was saying, well, the characters are not identical. One's not a ripoff of the other, but some of the things that have been in the stories could be. You need to have another trial to figure it out. But by this time, it was 1952. Captain Marvel's not selling nearly as well. Superheroes in general are kind of fading out at the time, and the EC war and horror comics are big. And so it wasn't really worth Fawcett's while anymore to keep fighting. So they settle out of court with National and agreed to not publish Captain Marvel anymore without DC's permission. And they didn't put any examples in the book, but apparently I think both Bridwell's essay and Wikipedia say that in the early 50s, Fawcett tried to do some Captain Marvel stories that mixed in horror elements to try to compete with EC, but it didn't work. And it's kind of hard to imagine how it could, because, if there's anything Captain Marvel wasn't, it's a horror comic.
Well, again, we've got Mr. Sandberg giving us an example of what could work.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, this movie was part horror movie, part comedy, part family drama, part superhero movie.
And the lads got rehired by DC to continue to work on Captain Marvel's stories later on, like down in the 60s, and some of those are in here. But the one I wanted to pick your brain on, there's a story from 1974. I don't know if it jumped out at you. It's Make Way for Captain Thunder.
Oh, yes, I did want to talk about that. Before we get to that, though, I did want to mention, so there was a publisher in the UK, L. Miller and Son, that had been publishing Captain Marvel reprints in black and white, but then Fawcett ceased publication of it, and Miller hired Mick Anglo to come up with a similar character they called Marvel Man.
Here we go.
That series abruptly changed from Captain Marvel to Marvel Man in issue 25. Now, a year ago, Kumar and Coombe did a whole episode on this, episode 606. But just to make sure we get that mentioned.
Oh, if only it'd been episode 616. Because Alan Moore came up with 616, the very concept of 616, in his Captain Britain run. And then he also, of course, did Marvel Man. And he sort of, I know that's what Kumar was talking about. And I like the whole Kumota magic word. So it's not a magic word. Now Kumota is almost like a sign that he's going to become this superhero character, but Kumota is the reverse of atomic. So it's like they took this magical character and they made him a science character. If anything, there's more reason to sue Mick Anglo than Fawcett, because he's more indebted to the sort of logic behind Superman, this idea of the atomic age has brought us all these new power over the natural world. What will that mean? What if it gives rise to a new kind of Superman? We have Superman, and then you have Marvel Man, who, again, is explicitly associated with the atomic age. But yeah, the Mick Anglo onwards, the whole history of Marvel Man is one big dog's breakfast.
Yes, yeah, that's a whole other mess. But yeah. So, there's no new Captain Marvel until finally in 1972, DC and Fawcett come to an agreement where DC can do Captain Marvel comics and Fawcett will get a licensing fee per page. Now, eventually, around the late 80s, I think, DC completely bought the rights to Captain Marvel. So now in the book, see, another problem with this book I felt like was that stuff happens and there's no context and not enough explanation. But also they make it even more confusing because in the sequence of the stories in here, we go from 1953 to 1974 and then back to 1973. Now the 73 story from Shazam #1, In the Beginning and the World's Wickedest Plan. So let's see. This is a story by Denny O'Neil with art by C.C. Beck. And it explains how the Marvels and Dr. Savannah were in suspended animation for almost 20 years. And this was, still on their own world, which became Earth S in DC parlance. And that was how they were trying to restart that series. But then, in 1974, which you were asking about a few minutes ago, this weird story, Make Way for Captain Thunder.
Yes,
now,
with Elias S. Magan and Kurt Swan, who are most closely associated with Superman, interestingly.
Yeah.
And here they are reinventing Captain Thunder.
Yeah, well, the name Captain Thunder was that was the name they were originally going to give to the character in 1939.
Yeah.
Now, so you get the story where, the hero's Captain Thunder. We've got Willie Fawcett rather than Billy Batson. And instead of saying holy moly, he keeps saying creepies. The dumbest exclamation I've ever heard. And Willie finds himself dropped into Metropolis from the Earth of some other dimension, I guess from Earth S or something. And Captain Thunder has been turned evil, so Superman has to help break the spell that's been put on him. But it's like, I was mystified by this story at first. Like, why are all the names changed? And he has a different logo on his shirt. It's kind of a sun rather than a lightning bolt.
Yeah, the acronym now refers to Native American mythology. But he's still a white kid.
Mm-hmm.
So I was going, okay, so Elliot S. Magan is trying to be progressive. He's trying to introduce this representation of Native American experience, but he's chosen to have this be decoration to this white power fantasy. This little white boy becomes Captain Thunder, and then he made him evil. Like, the whole thing was... I've never read this before. For me, this was the discovery of the entire collection.
Yeah, so I went Googling, like, what the heck is going on with this story? And I found a CBR article from about a year ago. And it explains that they wanted to have a story where Superman and Captain Marvel fight. But they somehow weren't sure that they could do it. And Elliot S. Magan, the writer of that story, was quoted in something called the Krypton Chronicles, saying, "We were trying to do the traditional Fawcett-style Captain Marvel in the Shazam book in those days. The style of artwork was different from Superman's. The degree of suspension of disbelief in the two story threads, Shazam as opposed to Superman, were different. I never really believed that Superman and Captain Marvel belonged in the same story, and neither did Julie Schwartz. The Captain Thunder story was a piece of speculation as to what Captain Marvel might be like if he lived in the real world. I think Metropolis in the 70s was what we thought of as the real world at the time." So, the CBR article portrayed it as sort of a test run for, if it would work to have Captain Marvel fight Superman. So they made it look like Captain Marvel, but changed all the names and for some reason changed the origin to this Native American background. But it's just the weirdest story, and there's no context for it or explanation in the book. So it's just super puzzling. And then it just keeps being puzzling because it seems like every few stories you're getting a complete reboot of the whole thing again as they keep, trying to make it stick, in the modern comics market.
Yeah, and it becomes weirdly nostalgic as well. For all their attempts to try and reintroduce them into the modern comics world, well, that means all the sort of relativist values of these new superheroes, new old superheroes, they can't make it stick with Captain Marvel, Shazam, because he's just too pure or something. So they keep reenacting the C.C. Beck art even. They keep redoing sort of homages to that initial story. And it's like sticking out like a sore thumb. It's very, very odd.
Mm-hmm.
I'm reminded of there was an Alan Moore comic from ABC Comics back in the 2000s, Terra Obscura, and he had a character. He had recreated another American comic book character called Tom Strong, who's he's this super science genius who also has been raised in this atmosphere, so he's very strong and he has his family, and there's elements of the Captain Marvel character with Tom Strong too. And then he meets a counterpart from another world, and his name is Tom Strange. And the comic was called Terra Obscura, and it feels almost like an evocation of that Elliot S. Magan story, where you've got these two versions of this character, and you've got this opposition between magic and science, and more again because he's such a classicist. He keeps pulling up all these old characters and then repurposing them for his ends. I wonder if he had read this one, because there's something similar between the two storylines. But yeah, I was very taken aback by that one. But at least it, as misguided as it might have been, and again, I don't quite understand why they are using Native American mythology in this way. At least it was different. At least it was trying something, whereas these sort of, as you just said, replaying the events from the first Fawcett comics. Was it Whiz Comics?
Yeah.
Which had the first Captain
he
Marvel story?
first appeared in Whiz #2.
Yeah. This sort of replaying of that moment, replaying of that origin story again and again and again, it becomes as repetitive as the Batman origin.
Yeah. And then a few stories later, there's this really confusing story from DC Comics Presents 49 from 1982. So Superman's in it again. It starts out there's a scene with him, and then we see Billy Batson in what seems to be a retelling of Captain Marvel's origin, but then it turns out to be Billy Batson's dream. And, he, like this younger Billy who isn't Captain Marvel and apparently is native to the regular DC Earth. What is it? Earth 1? And Black Adam shows up, and Billy and Superman summon Captain Marvel from some other Earth, but he's not the same person as Billy. And I was like, what is this? What? Oh, it's just really confusing that there was this other Billy who looked just like Billy, but he was younger. And I don't know, maybe the idea was that when he got to be a little bit older, then he would be that Earth's Shazam, Captain Marvel. I don't know.
Yeah.
But, there's no context in this book, so I wasn't sure what to make of that one either. Yeah.
There's, because we had a sort of a new take on the character a few years later. Let's see, I think it was Captain Marvel, The Power of Shazam. So they couldn't call the comic itself Captain Marvel, because Marvel had by now introduced their Captain Marvel and various iterations of that character. So now you can't have a book from DC on the shelves called Captain Marvel. So you have Jerry Ordway in The Power of Shazam, and I quite like. I don't think it features in this collection either. So there's all these stories that I have a fondness for that they're not here. But there was a crossover between Ordway's Captain Marvel and then James Robinson's Starman. And I really like that storyline. And it got into this sort of the idea of Starman being this modern character whose father was a superhero back in the 40s and 50s. So he has this understanding of these traditional values and how the society has changed. Now he's been placed in this position where he's to inherit his father's mantle, and he resents it. He doesn't want to be a superhero. And he's trying to do his own thing. And then you've got Captain Marvel, and he represents the sort of classic era, and there's a conflict between the two characters. And I thought that did a better job of illustrating this idea of times have changed, and maybe Captain Marvel doesn't fit anymore, but he still represents something good. and there's still room for him, but that nature of the character, the way he behaves, is just at odds with everyone today. And there's something interesting about that as a concept, as opposed to making him a goofball or silly or stupid, frankly. But this idea of him, he just has this purity of intent that maybe even his peers in the superhero community just don't understand anymore, because they have day jobs and they are compromised in other ways, and they just understand that's how life is, and let's just get on with it. And being a superhero is almost like a day job. You're doing what you're doing to pay the rent, whereas he's doing what he's doing for truth, justice, and the American way. Sorry, someone's going to sue me now. Ripping off Superman.
Yeah. So, but I didn't put a lot of my notes about the last part. But we get a lot of like partial stories toward the end. There was this one where he's fighting against Lobo. But
never read that one before.
It's just part of the issue. I ended up going to Comixology to buy the whole thing just to see, because the ending is really confusing, because they're fighting and then suddenly Captain Marvel disappears, and then the next page we're on to something else. But the issue actually doesn't explain where he disappeared to. I suppose he showed up in another title after that or something.
Was there some time travel stuff going on there? Because Legion, I thought, was a book set in the future. I could be wrong.
I'm not sure about that. I don't know much about Legion. But yeah, that was kind of confusing, and yeah, they kept changing it, and it just was puzzling sometimes going through this book.
Well, given that the character has had such a pained publication history, I feel it's almost appropriate that this collection has been curated in a way to leave you slightly dissatisfied. It does capture just the approach to the character has just been really strained for a long time, because it's almost this poison chalice. It's like, what are you going to do with Captain Marvel? You can't even call him Captain Marvel. What are we doing with this character?
In the movie, they never came up with a name for him. They just left it vague.
Yeah. But there's one thing in the movie I really liked, and I don't know if Jeff Johns has done this in the recent comic book series, but I did like that the kids are using Shazam to do YouTube stunts and to go viral on YouTube and all that kind of stuff. I thought was really clever. I thought that was an interesting idea that like it's almost the superhero's influencer. The film I thought was affable and imaginative and fun, and I actually walked out of the cinema at the time. Like, my wife came to see with me, and at the end of the movie, she just looked over me. She said, "You look like you're 12 years old." I'd gone back in time because I was like, "Oh my god, this is amazing!" So yeah, I enjoyed it a lot. Sorry.
This book has a segment of Jeff Smith's version.
Yes.
Now, when I was in Chicago, I saw like the whole set of, or the whole book, I don't remember how much of it there is, of Jeff Smith's, and somehow I just felt like Shazam drawn like Bone wasn't really what I wanted, even though I love Smith's work on Bone, but somehow this just didn't, even though it looks really good, it just somehow it wasn't what I wanted. I don't know, have you read the whole thing?
I have, and it's one of my favorite versions of the character, and I actually think, again, the segment of the story featured here doesn't do it justice. I would recommend, if anyone's interested in the character of Shazam or interested in this sort of themes of Shazam, to get it. Because I think Jeff Smith's one of the few people who has that, interest in telling these kinds of stories, and is able to play with humor and then horror as well. And it worked as a package, as an overall package. There was another aimed at kids Captain Marvel Shazam title that came out after Jeff Smith's version. And it's not featured here either. And I feel that's... I'll look it up now as we speak. That was another one which I thought just captured the idea. But yeah, Jeff Smith's one is worth getting. I would recommend you check it out.
And then, the last story in the book we mentioned already is the Justice League issue 21, written by Jeff Johns and drawn by Gary Frank, where we're kind of coming in the middle of the story here, which doesn't help very much. I wasn't quite sure who the bald guy was. I guess he's Dr. Savannah.
It's Dr. Savannah. Yeah, it's
at
the
first
version
I was
of the
wondering
character
if
that
it
Mark
was
Strong.
Lex Luthor, but
No. Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, this is very much the outline of the movie.
It is, and it's interesting, isn't it, that they have it's a Black Adam featured in the comic and not in the film, because I think that even has become quite complicated because supposedly Dwayne Johnson is meant to be playing Black Adam, and they just didn't have their ducks in a row yet, or maybe they wanted to test the waters with this film, and it didn't really get a lot of marketing push, didn't get a lot of support. I felt it was seen as a minor film, and it came out and it was quite successful. And maybe this was the story treatment, because this was a backup comic as well. It wasn't even a main comic. It was a Justice League backup comic where Jeff Johns was reintroducing the character to the New 52, and this was his take. I did find it interesting. So you have seen the film?
Yes.
Of course you have. We spoke about it before.
Yeah, in April in Chicago.
So for those of you listening, if you haven't seen the film, spoilers next 30 seconds. But Billy Batson's adopted family in the film, the moment they all become versions of themselves, superhero versions of themselves, is a beautiful moment. I think it's a really fun moment. It's great.
Yeah,
it's exact this.
Not having read any, certainly not any of the recent comics at the time, I was not expecting it at all. Exactly. Same thing happens in the story, and it just falls flat. Like, the initial moment is beautiful because it's the same shot almost. It's them all standing in a line, and they've got these amazing powers, and then they just fall over almost. You don't have the same extended sequence of them all trying their powers for the first time, actually getting somewhere with their powers, like being able to go toe to toe with these demonic creatures that they're facing off against. In the comic, there is still this sense of a pecking order almost. And it was weird to me that you could actually spend more time with this in the comic. You could spend more time developing this idea because it's cheaper than a movie, and it just doesn't work as well. Yeah, well, I wonder is that partly because they had more room to stretch it out in the movie? I mean, if you tried to do that scene in the movie as a comic, I think it would take up a lot more pages.
Potentially, yeah. Well, I think of it. Sorry, the other book I wanted to mention, to give a shout out to, is a book called Billy Batson and the Magic of Shazam, and it's by Art Baltazar and Byron Vaughns on art. And that's another very nice take on the character that I thought was interesting. And then, of course, Doc Shaner got to do a take on Shazam for the Convergence event, which is where all of these DC characters got mixed up, their concepts got mixed up, and we got these different versions of them. And Convergence was an excuse for somebody to pay Doc Shaner money to do a Shazam story, and he has this very classic style, and it worked really well. And it just happens to be a great, fun comic. Also, it's written by Jeff Parker, who is one of the best comic writers out there. Who doesn't get his due, but I think he's one of the most dependable ones.
Yeah.
Neither of those books feature in this collection.
There is a current ongoing Shazam comic. I haven't read any of it. Have you?
This is the Jeff Johns one.
Right. Well, this one that's in the book is from 2013. but there's one that's coming out now. I'm just looking at Comixology. Number 9 is what's this? Number 9 is available September 4th.
Yeah.
But I assume this is a new series, not the same one that this story appeared in.
Oh yeah, sorry. So you had New 52, and now we're DC New or whatever it is now. They've restarted the continuity again, but it's still Jeff Johns, and it's Dale Eaglesham on art.
Mm-hmm.
And it still has this take of Billy being a bit of a delinquent, and I think the film uses some of the same elements again because Jeff Johns is involved in both. So he has this oversight over the films and the comics. I don't think he has any longer. I think he's retreated a bit from his role in the filmmaking side of this. But yeah, he's been stewarding the character for the last few years.
Yeah. So, yeah, I'm kind of curious about the current series. I might take a look at it.
Yeah, but if you... There's the Jeff Parker, Doc Shaner, what I mentioned to you, that there's only 2 issues of it. It was out in 2015. Snap them up. Honestly, man. It's beautiful art, and the story's great.
Is that also called Shazam, or what's the title?
It's Convergence Shazam.
Convergence Shazam, okay.
Yeah, check that one out. Definitely. Is there anything else you want to say about it? I mean, overall, I think it was a bit of a treasure trove. There were some great moments from the history of the character that I haven't seen before, and there was some stuff in there, like, as I said before, the Mac Raboy art in Captain Marvel Jr. is just a revelation. The Captain Nazi story, it's a beautiful, beautiful story.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's sort of the pickings become slimmer the further in you go.
Yeah. Yeah. It gets kind of frustrating, like I said, once DC starts doing it. But yeah, the earlier stuff from the 40s is pretty enjoyable. In a way that I don't think any comics being produced are fun in this way nowadays.
I mean, I guess the counterexample that I feel almost obliged to mention whenever I hear something like that is Ryan North's Squirrel Girl, I think.
Okay.
Is very good.
I've read some of that.
And, it has that same sense of fun about it and just wackiness and imagination. And, I always want to call it out for that. And there is some stuff in the independent scene which has an aspect of this too, but yeah, it is getting tougher to maintain this same level of enthusiasm for some of these characters and not look like nostalgic creep, frankly. Because, like, I want to read the stories, and I want to have a good time reading these stories. I want them to be fun, and somehow that is seen as a dated attitude. And I'm not one to argue, so I'm just going, all right, fine. I'll just read these classic runs and just enjoy them. But yeah, some of the over-reliance on shock and horror in superhero stories just feels grubby and nasty to me, as opposed to genuinely shocking and horrific. I mean, I think the idea of a superhero in a horror space is a very interesting idea, and there are examples of writers like Alan Moore and Warren Ellis and Grant Morrison, and Gail Simone as well, who have done some really interesting work in this idea of using horror themes in the genre. But just by and large, I don't think the folks who are going up to bat get it and get how to actually be shocking in a way that feels disturbing, as opposed to being just kind of grubby and exploitative. Do you follow what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, a lot of times that kind of thing feels just kind of obligatory to me. Like,
I think
we're supposed to do it this way. And I think currently DC is kind of more in that space than Marvel is.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at some of the work that is coming out at the moment by the artist Russell Dauterman, he's doing a lot of work on Thor with Jason Aaron. And it's beautiful art. Like, it's stunning stuff. And I mean, when you're doing something like that, you can't be grubby because you're putting so much work in, Whereas if you have various characters getting their arms and legs ripped off on panel. It's just, no, thank you. Please stop.
Yeah. Okay, so do you think this book is recommendable, or is there something else people should look at instead about Shazam? Do you know, are there any collections that are just the 40s stuff?
I'm not sure, actually. I think there are some... I have seen some collections, some like classic Shazam. I don't know if they're available digitally or you'd have to go hunting for them. That do try and capture the Fawcett year. So I do think that stuff's out there. You can get it. It isn't widely available though, and I think if you want a sort of starter pack for the characters, this is a great book to get. Like for all my moaning the last half an hour, I think it is a great introduction to the character, and it does have some amazing highlights in there. So I would recommend people get this book. Just bear in mind, the character has a very troubled publishing history, and this book almost is a testament to some of that, as we've said before.
I'm looking on Amazon. I see there is a series of Shazam archive editions that are hardcovers. I'm not sure if these are on Comixology, but on Amazon I see they're kind of pricey.
That's the trade-off there.
Yeah.
Whereas this isn't that bad, and again, as I said at the start, I did pick it up digitally in a sale, and it worked out quite well for me. I think, as I said before, Jeff Smith's Shazam and the Monster Society of Evil does channel a lot of that classic sort of ethos really well, and I'm trying to look at this one here. Shazam, a celebration of 75 years. Yeah, that's easily accessible. That's still on Comixology. So if folks want to get it and they don't want to have to look it around like you did, unfortunately from Chicago, that's an option. It's there. But I also would recommend the JLA storyline I mentioned that Grant Morrison and Howard Porter did. The Crisis Times 5, which was, I know I said it before, but I'll say it again, issues 28 to 31 of the Grant Morrison JLA run. That nails the character. That's a really good edition. I think it's in the third or fourth JLA collected graphic novel. But those issues are great, and I would recommend them.
Okay.
But yeah, I feel like I feel a bit drained because I do enjoy this character a lot. I do want to try and go to bat for him, but I kind of feel I like a bit shrill almost when I talk about him, because it's like it's really good, but people can't write him for some reason. You know, that doesn't scan for me. You know.
Yeah, it doesn't look like those archive editions are on Comixology. You got to buy the hardcovers if you want them.
There you go.
So, but there seems to be quite a bit of other Shazam stuff that's available as Comixology Unlimited, which I subscribe to, so I can just borrow them for free for as long as I want. So, not that I'm not being paid to say that, although if Comixology wants to pay me to say it, they're welcome to.
Very smooth.
So, yeah. There's a lot of stuff out there that's a lot cheaper than buying those hardcovers. This book is not a bad place to start to get kind of an overview of the history.
I'd agree. Yeah.
Shazam, a celebration of 75 years, is published by DC. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the history of Captain Marvel or the direction of the podcast generally. What would you like to hear on the show? Email us at mail@deconstructingcomics.com, tweet us at deconcomics, like our Facebook page, or join our active Facebook group. We'd also really appreciate your supporting us with a pledge on Patreon. Our tiers start at just $2 a month. Pledge at least $4 a month to get our Patreon-only series Spider-Man 1963 and Tim Catches Up with the MCU. Go to patreon.com/deconcomics to join the fun. Also, please help us get noticed by reviewing us on Apple or any other podcast source. Do your shopping at deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon so that we get a percentage of the sale. And share our episodes on your social media. We appreciate your support in bringing Deconstructing Comics, Critiquing Comics, and To the Batpoles to a larger audience. Our theme is from bensound.com. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and Mulele and I will critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read at least 30 pages of it and critique it on the show. Mulele and I will be here next week to talk about the anthology book Monster Mashup. But first, right here in this podcast feed, a fond farewell to Mad Magazine. Award-winning cartoonist of Mad and The New Yorker, Joe Dater, joins Kumar and me to discuss some of the highlights of Mad and why it's now going under. That's this weekend. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.